Hello. Welcome to the first Digital Access webinar of 2022. I hope you're all having a lovely Thursday, and thank you so much for joining with us today. My name is Ben Gilmore. I'm the lead user experience consultant here at Digital Access in Vision Australia. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Jacinta Oakley, one of our talented UX consultants who will be taking us through the subject of typography and inclusive design. Live captioning is available today if you need it. And please add any questions into the Q&A channel if you want to, and we'll try and see if we can get to them at the end of Jacinta's presentation. And also we've got a few questions we might answer that people have sent ahead of time. So really, without any further ado, I might just hand over straight to Jacinta. She's got quite a lot to cover today, so I want to give her as much time as possible. I'll hand over to you, Jacinta.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's so great to see so many people here to have a conversation about accessibility and today's conversation about inclusive typography. Just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen and my slides okay before I proceed. Wonderful. I can see that that's coming through. Okay. So as we meet in this virtual space today, firstly, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're all joining from Indigenous peoples' lands today in Australia and around the world. So I'm joining this morning from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any Indigenous peoples who may be with us on the webinar today. And I'd encourage you all to reflect on what lands you're joining us from today. And on this slide, I briefly just wanted to share with you an artwork by Holly McLennan Brown, a proud Yorta Yorta woman and contemporary Aboriginal artist. It was commissioned by Vision Australia for our Reconciliation Action Plan. The circles in the centre of the artwork represent the Vision Australia community, and the U-shapes around this represent people and clients coming together with Vision Australia. The white lines leading from the centre of the artwork are various pathways and services that Vision Australia offers to people who are blind and low vision, including the focus areas of employment, education, social inclusion and independence. I see people popping the Indigenous country there on in the chat, which is great. Feel free to keep that coming through. Okay, so just to start with a really quick intro. So my name's Jacinta Oakley. I'm a user experience consultant here at Digital Access at Vision Australia. So my main roles and responsibilities are around research and usability testing with people with all kinds of disability. So we don't just work with people with low vision or people who are blind. And basically we aim to understand how we can create more accessible products, services and web content for everyone. I studied graphic design at university and have worked across the essential services and not-for-profit sectors in research and design. I have a real passion for accessibility, which is what led me to Vision Australia. And I believe that we actually can't design without considering inclusive design. Just to offer a brief physical description, I'm a young woman with brown hair. I'm wearing a colourful top, yellow earrings, and have a blurred background. Sitting at my desk, and there'll be slides displayed throughout this presentation. I'll offer visual description when it's adding extra information than what I'm speaking to. And so who are we at Digital Access? We work in the space of digital accessibility. So you can see a number of our services on the right-hand side of the slide here, and these range from auditing and training through to consulting. And I'm involved in our usability testing, co-design and strategic consulting services. And basically at Digital Access, we teach and practice inclusive design. So this involves considering the full range of human diversity, including factors like age, gender, culture, and language, which are highlighted on this slide. And our expertise and scope at Digital Access is research and design with people with disability. So we believe that the responsibility lies not with individuals, but with all of us to design a world that's more inclusive. So today we're going to be talking about typography. And firstly, let's just look at what exactly do we mean when we say typography. So typography is the art and technique of arranging text on a page. And this can choose things like the fonts we use. This can involve things like the fonts we choose and how we organize text on a page, font sizes, the length of lines in a paragraph, even spacing between the individual letters and lines of text. And it's all about how we can make text more legible, readable, and appealing. Since we're digital access, we'll focus on typography in the digital context today. So why are we talking about typography? There's a particular research study that was conducted by a London design and typography firm, which I think just kind of illustrates why it's incredibly important really nicely. So the study included people with low vision, people with dyslexia, and people of all ages who didn't identify as having a disability. And you can see the characters and words here on the left-hand side of the page. These were ones that were confused by all participants in one way or another. So many participants sometimes read clear as deer, for example, or turn as thumb. But the study also showed that these additional characters on the right-hand side also were confused by some people with low vision or dyslexia. So this study really highlights the importance of accessible typography and the clear benefit of considering typography with an inclusive lens for everyone. So this is a great illustration of why designing for people with disability can equal a better experience for all, which is really what we believe and what we strive for at Digital Access. Okay, so you might be thinking, why do I need to know typography? Well, every time we write something is an opportunity to consider typography. And just to broaden out our scope for today, we're not just going to be talking about typography in the context of websites and apps, but typography is also really important to consider every time we write an email or post something or design something for social media. Presenting a presentation like this one, or for documents viewed on screen or interacted with on screen like forms and PDFs, other online content like blogs, or even other digital interfaces like payment terminals, for example. And there's a whole bunch of people that might be involved in making and designing typography, obviously designers and developers, but right through to brand and marketing, internal comms and HR teams. And of course, we want to be involving our end users in our design process. Okay, so just to give a really brief overview of what we're hoping to cover in today's webinar. Firstly, we'll touch on some of the accessibility guidelines, so what they are and what they do and don't say about typography. We'll look at the impacts of inaccessible design for people with disability in more detail. We'll look at the anatomy of a typeface and some features to look out for, how we might go about choosing an accessible typeface, and practical tips for formatting, layout, and styling. Just want to also note that all this context relates to text that's written in English. So there might be specific typographic considerations for other language and scripts. Just something to keep in mind. And before we get into the good stuff, also just want to call out what we're not covering today in this webinar, but is also super important, is how to write accessible content. So this is a huge topic in itself and might be one for a future webinar, but is unfortunately not in scope for today. This slide just highlights some top high-level tips for writing inclusive, accessible content, but I'll write a follow-up blog post after this webinar where there'll be more detailed information on that and some links to useful resources, but things like always using plain language, so really simple English, providing easy English versions of material when it's appropriate, breaking up content with clear headings and subheadings, and using dot points and numbered lists are some key things to think about. But today we're going to be talking more about how text is visually styled and arranged on a page. So why should we take an inclusive lens to typography? Well, the accessibility guidelines are a really great starting point for the accessibility of text, and they'll get us to a baseline minimum standard. So firstly, let's talk about what we mean when we're saying accessibility guidelines. So I'm referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG. So these are an internationally recognized benchmark for web content accessibility, with the goal of making the web more accessible to people with disabilities. You can see here that the guidelines do have a little bit to say about things like making sure text has appropriate contrast with its background, making sure that users can resize text up to 200%, I believe is the success criteria. Advice on images of text, like generally avoiding them and how to make them accessible to users using assistive technology like screen readers. Making sure text content is responsive across platforms. So that means it's easy to read and accessible on both desktop and mobile versions of content, for example. Making sure users can change the space between letters and lines of text. So this doesn't mean that websites need built-in functions to be able to do that, but it means if users are using other tools to customize the spacing between letters and lines of text, the website won't block them from doing that. And making sure the text has appropriate heading structure. So there's a few recommendations in WCAG that explore that. But what I want to highlight here is that WCAG doesn't have a lot to say about typography itself. So again, the choice of fonts and detailed guidelines about how we treat these fonts, like font size and font weight and font layout. So we do need to go above and beyond these guidelines that provide us with a minimum standard. So usability testing also shows us that inaccessible typography can have impacts for the way people are able to read and understand key information. So this is something that comes up a lot for us in projects and usability testing across different contexts at Digital Access. And the two key cohorts or functional groups of disability, as we call them here at Digital Access, that are most impacted are people with vision disabilities and people with cognitive and or learning disabilities. So let's break those two groups down and look a bit more at what we mean by those terms. So when we refer to people with vision disabilities at Digital Access, we're talking about three key groups: low vision, colour blindness, and people who are blind. So for people with low vision, typography primarily affects them in that individual letters can be more difficult to perceive, or text and paragraph formatting can make it more difficult to read passages of text. So often people with low vision will need to zoom in or enlarge content on a screen to help them perceive it and read it. So people might do this by pinching and zooming on a mobile or touchscreen device, or using inbuilt zoom controls on a computer like Control+ and Control-. They might also have dedicated screen magnifying software on their phone or computer that magnifies a small portion of the screen, which follows around the user's mouse or finger. So that's what you can see in the right-hand side of this slide, a snapshot of that. So this is what means that layout is another really important thing to consider when designing text content. So for people who are blind, somewhat surprisingly, typography can also impact this functional group. So many people who are blind or low vision will use assistive technology like screen readers that read aloud on-screen content like websites or documents. So typography can impact how text content is actually read out by screen readers, and we'll touch on a few examples of this today. And finally, colour blindness. So mainly the contrast of text against the background is an important thing to consider and something that comes up often for people with both colour blindness and low vision. Contrast is important to consider for all elements of design, though not just typography. And this is a really large topic, so it is unfortunately out of scope for this webinar today, whilst we'd love to talk about everything. But there's previous blogs and webinars from Digital Access that address this topic, and I'll talk about it a bit more in my blog also. Okay, so now let's look at impacts of inaccessible typography for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. So firstly, I want to acknowledge that this is an extremely diverse category, and every person's experience and needs are, of course, unique. But at Digital Access, we work with and consider anyone who identifies as neurodiverse. And most commonly in our research, this includes people with dyslexia, people with autism, and people with ADHD. So people who are neurodiverse generally will experience differences in neurological development and processing. And based on usability testing conducted at Digital Access, common issues we see coming up around typography are for people with dyslexia, experiencing differences in the way brain recalls and works with letters and sounds might mean there's some difficulty recognizing letters and words. We see complex design and layout can impact people's ability to process written information. And I think we can all relate to sometimes being overwhelmed or bombarded with a whole heap of content, and particularly text content when landing on a website. And difficulty reading text can also lead to increased mental load and distraction. Okay, we'll now get into some practical advice for when it comes to accessible typefaces and what to look out for. Okay, firstly, let's just pause and define what we mean by typeface. So fonts might be a word that you're more accustomed to hearing. And on the right-hand side of this slide, we have a whole bunch of some of the most popular fonts in the world. And these are actually different variations of the one typeface, Helvetica. So we've got Helvetica Bold, Helvetica Light, Helvetica Oblique or Italics. And so the typeface is actually the name for a group of complementary fonts. When you think font, you're probably really thinking typeface, and these terms are often used pretty interchangeably, but I think it's helpful to just define up front. For clarity, I'll try to use the word typeface for the rest of the webinar. Okay, so let's look briefly at the anatomy of a typeface. This slide highlights and labels some of the key terms used to describe the anatomy of a typeface. To provide a quick visual description, the word typography is labeled with a number of arrows to show different features of the letter forms and word. And there is a lot going on this slide, so there's no need to try and take it all in or absorb any of the terms. I just wanted to call out that there is a lot of jargon in this field, and designers do tend to love jargon. But for the purpose of today, I'll try to avoid new and complex terms wherever possible, or define any jargon terms as they come up straight away. And straight up, some more terms to define. Any accessible typeface should be both legible and readable. So these terms are again often used interchangeably, but legibility, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, we have two different typefaces, one that's much easier to see the individual letters, and one more cursive type script font that's much more difficult to see the individual letters. So legibility relates to how effectively a person can distinguish between individual letters. And then we have readability, which is how effectively a person can understand sentences and actually sustain reading comfortably for a long period of time. So readability considers factors like effort and ease and comfort when reading. Additional barriers there are many additional barriers to legibility and readability for people with disability. And it's important to consider legibility as a baseline, so being able to see and read the individual letters, but we want to aim for readability and comfortable reading and consuming and understanding content as a great experience for people. So let's look at some 8 accessible typeface tips to help make sure text is legible and readable for people with disability, and therefore, hopefully everyone. Okay, so the first tip is to choose fonts with a taller X height. So when we say X height, we mean fonts that have more space for lowercase letters. So you can see there's 2 examples on the screen here, both the same font size, and one that has a larger X height means the body of the main body of a lowercase letter has more room and is therefore more legible. Tip number 2 is to choose more open typefaces. So the size of an open space within a letter, like the opening in the curve of a letter C or the opening at the bottom of a lowercase e, is called the aperture. So looking for faces, typefaces which are more open or that have larger apertures are generally going to be more legible and more accessible. And closely related to this is tip number 3. So choose typefaces with larger white spaces within letters. So white spaces within the letters are called counter spaces. So we can see them in the holes in the middle of a capital B, for example, or in the letter 8. And they're also in the open spaces like the top of a double story A. So having letters with larger white space means they're more easy to distinguish from one another and therefore more legible. So choosing typefaces without joined letters is tip number 4. And when letters are joined together, we call that a ligature. So the left-hand side of the screen here shows a script font with joined letters, and next to it is a cursive font, which is still a hand-drawn type font, but without joined letters. And the one without the joined letters is far more legible and easy to distinguish each letter. The right-hand side of the screen shows ligatures or joins that can occur between individual letters. And these can be confusing to people visually as they're not common letters or characters that we're used to seeing, and they can be quite jarring, but they can also be a problem for screen readers. So some screen readers struggle to read typefaces with ligatures depending on the HTML or the code that sits behind the text. So sometimes it will not be read as 2 individual letters, but unfamiliar symbols. So testing fonts with screen readers is always recommended, and I can mention more about how to go about doing that in the follow-up blog. So tip number 5, choose typefaces with recognizable letters. So we have here what we call imposter letters. So imposter letters are when letters are easily mistaken for one another. So in some typefaces like Gill Sans, you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, the uppercase I, lowercase l, and letter 1 are practically indistinguishable. Whereas in a typeface like Verdana, each of these characters is unique due to additional strokes and lengths of the letters, which makes them far more legible. So we can see an example of this in context with the word milliliter. So lots of I's and L's going on, and as this gets smaller with certain fonts where the letters don't have unique characteristics, all of these kind of just blur into one, and it can be quite difficult to read. Whereas having a little flick on the bottom of the L, for example, can help to distinguish it much more easily from the lowercase I. And further on this point around choosing typefaces with recognizable letters, we recommend avoiding typefaces with mirroring letters that are easily mistaken for one another. So for example, we have Public Sans, where the lowercase d and lowercase b are practically a mirror image of one another. Whereas we have the BBC Wreath typeface, which has more unique letter shapes for these 2 letter forms. Okay, tip number 6, looking at spacing between letters. So the spacing between letters, or adjusting this space, is called tracking. So we can see here that if letters are tracked or spaced too close together, they can be difficult to read and blur into one. And if they're spaced too far apart, the difference between letters within a word and the next word can become confusing, and it's just far less legible. So you can see the ideal spacing in the middle there between the letters, and this will vary from font to font. But one thing to look out for, and a practical tip that we can all take away from this, is to look for fonts with proportional proportional tracking or letter spacing. So for example, monospace fonts that have the same spacing and width of letters are far less legible, particularly for long passages of text, whereas proportional letter spacing can help the shapes of letters and words be more easily recognizable. So tip number 7, limit using all caps text. So this is largely, again, due to the shape of the letters and words being the way that we all, or many of us, read and recognize text. So having lowercase letters will give the word shape, for example, a unique shape with ups and downs, whereas if we put this in all caps, it just becomes one big rectangle. So again, we recommend limiting the use or avoiding the use of all caps, but if you do need to use it, for example, for a logo or a small heading, we recommend finding a font with larger spacing between the letters, so looser tracking, or adjusting this yourself if you are a designer. So on the right-hand side of the screen, I just wanted to also point out some considerations for screen reader users when it comes to using all caps. So for example, the word contact us written in all caps actually reads contact US. And if we have a FAQs section on our site, if we have FAQs in capital with no apostrophe before the S, it'll actually read far Qs, which doesn't sound incredibly polite. So testing fonts and text with screen readers is, again, recommended. Okay, so and tip number 8, avoid images of text. Says me, who's ironically been using them to illustrate accessible typography throughout this presentation. But in design, we do recommend avoiding images of text wherever possible, although we recognize they might be used in some contexts, for example, a logo. You can see here the issue with images of text is when they are zoomed in to be read, they become incredibly pixelated and often illegible. There's also considerations for screen reader users in that unless images of text have appropriate alternative text applied to them, and they won't be able to be read by screen reader users. Okay, so those were 8 key tips to refer to when choosing or working with any font to see if it's accessible or improve its accessibility. And now let's look at putting some of those accessible tips into practice and talk about choosing a typeface. So a really common question we get asked at Digital Access, and one I'm sure many of you might have who have joined the webinar today, is, so what font should I use? Or what font, what typeface is the most accessible? And unfortunately, there is no golden egg or one size fits all solution, but we can start to look at applying some of what we've learned so far, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some practical advice for where to start when choosing a font, and discuss some of the more common fonts and types of fonts that are more accessible. So the first important thing to call out when considering choosing a typeface is to think about the context. So what tone do you want your content to convey? For example, is it a really playful tone? Is it very formal and professional? This might impact the typeface that you want to choose. Who is your audience? Are they young or old? What's the demographic? What type of text content is it? Are we looking at choosing a font for body text? Are we looking at headings? And where and what platform will the text be read? Will it be read on a small screen, a really high resolution screen? Things like that are important to consider and can help guide our decision making when choosing a typeface. And there are so many different typefaces out there that it can be pretty overwhelming and difficult to know where to start. So to help break down the different options, it can be useful to understand different types of typefaces. So typefaces are split into groups based on common characteristics, and these groups are called families. And also just want to acknowledge that this is a complex field and there's lots of deliberation about different classifications, but I've tried to present ones that will be useful to us to consider from an accessible typography lens today. So here are 5 common typeface families that you might recognize. And today we'll spend most of our time talking about serif and sans serif typefaces, when they are best used and which types are most accessible. And for those who are familiar with the accessibility space, you'll know that the debate around which of these 2 is most accessible is ongoing. So we'll try and also just address this. And the other fonts you can see here on the screen, and apologies, one of them is not showing up correctly, is script, monotype, and display fonts. Okay, so there's 3 families, script, monospace, and display, generally have more accessibility issues, so we recommend avoiding them. If you've considered it carefully and you feel like you do need to use one, we recommend using it in moderation, like for a logo or a short heading, and refer to the 8 accessible typeface tips to assess how accessible it might be. And you're just going to have to imagine with me a little bit on this slide, but as we talk about script fonts, but script fonts are generally often quite, they have a handwritten feel, they're quite cursive and inspired by calligraphy. They can offer a warm kind of human tone, but the key accessibility issue is joins between the letters. So if you must use a script font, consider a cursive variety instead, which generally doesn't have the joins as we looked at earlier, and avoid cursive or script fonts that are italicized, as this does impact legibility and readability. So again, monospace fonts are generally not recommended for long passages of text due to the lack of proportionate spacing, which we looked at before. However, some studies do show that these have been proven to be more accessible for some people with dyslexia. But again, it comes back to the context you're using them in, and always user testing with people with disability in that context. Display fonts, another one to address. So these are kind of any other fancy fandangled type fonts that don't fit into any of the other families that we've talked about. And these are generally best avoided due to unfamiliar letter shapes and other potential legibility issues. And there are many other ways, I suppose, to try and add tone and character to design, although this might feel like limiting a whole pool of typefaces. Just want to emphasize throughout this that there are no hard and fast, do use this, don't use this. It's always use, I guess, our knowledge about what makes a typeface accessible or not to make our own assessment. Okay, so again, let's look at serif and sans serif fonts. So the debate around which one of these is best for use in the digital context is ongoing. So let's explore that today. But first, let's just define what is a serif exactly. So a serif is a small line or stroke that's attached to the ends of a larger stroke in a letter. And this is thought to have originated from early writings on stone. And sans serif, sans meaning without, don't have these extra lines or strokes on the end of letters. Okay, so serif typefaces were traditionally thought to be more accessible for print because serifs create a consistent line for the eye to follow when reading long passages, like reading a novel, for example, and this is still the most common type of typeface used to print long form text like novels. And sans serif are often said to be best for digital because the serifs were thought to add extra noise on the screen or take up pixels, But particularly today with high resolution screens, this is definitely not a blanket rule from our perspective, and both can be accessible if they have the qualities we discussed earlier, and of course are tested with users with disability. So let's talk about if we decide to choose a sans serif font, how we might go about choosing what specific typeface we want to use. So this slide shows some of the common sans serif typefaces you might be familiar with. On the left hand of the slide, we have some that are less accessible and some that have more accessible features. So all of the accessible typefaces on the right hand side are what we call humanist sans serif typefaces. And the letters and shapes are inspired by handwriting. On the left hand side of the page, we have some with less accessible features, which are known as geometric sans serif. So here the letters and shapes are inspired by geometric shapes like squares and circles, which makes them much more uniform. So let's just quickly zoom in and have a look at what makes humanist sans serifs like Calibri, to give a very common example, more accessible. So what makes them more accessible is the fact that they have a lot of the features that we talked about earlier. So things like unique letter shapes and widths, open apertures like you can see on the lowercase e, and large counter spaces. So to summarize, if you're going to choose a sans serif font, look for a humanist typeface. So Calibri, Vedana, and Tahoma are very common examples. And I can hear the collective sigh from designers. I definitely don't want the takeaway from this to be you can only use Calibri. Definitely not what I'm trying to say, but rather that using common examples, trying to highlight that humanist typefaces in general are a great starting point because they have a lot of accessible characteristics, but there are many others out there. For example, I know some of the new Microsoft typefaces that are coming in 2022, like Seaford and Skeena, do have some humanist qualities. And again, just refer to the checklist and use a test with whatever typeface you are considering using. Okay, so let's similarly break down how we might go about choosing a serif typeface. And again, these can be considered on a scale from those with less accessible features to those that possess more. And we have typefaces like Georgia and Sabon on the right-hand side due to their open apertures, large X heights, and these are great for body text on the web when not styled too small. A controversial one here I do just want to call out is Times New Roman. So this is traditionally often considered quite accessible, although opinions will vary on this, but I've placed it somewhat in the middle here as it has narrow letters and thick serifs, makes for more closed apertures and counter spaces, which could impede legibility. But something to think about when choosing a font is also that common fonts, common typefaces that people are used to seeing, that also goes a long way towards making them accessible as familiar letter forms is something that does help with readability and legibility, sorry. Okay, again, just to zoom in and compare some of these fonts, we can see some more varied line thickness, which makes for a more unique shape in fonts like Georgia, and a more open aperture illustrated in the open space in the lowercase e. Whereas another thing to look out for, and what makes some of these other serif typefaces I pointed out perhaps less accessible for things like body text, is real high contrast in line thickness. So real thin lines can be quite difficult to see on screen, for example. Okay, so just to quickly recap the difference between serif and sans serif. Generally, serifs are great for large text like headings, larger or smaller body text, and can be a good option for lower resolution screens, like perhaps something like a payment terminal. And we discussed some common typefaces like Calibri, Vedana, and Tahoma. But generally just opting for a humanist typeface of some description is a great place to start. So choosing a serif typeface, these can be great for large text like headings or larger body text, but consider them carefully for smaller body text or lower resolution screens in a digital context. And again, we touched on typefaces like Georgia and Sabon. But to sound like a broken record, I guess it does come back to considering your context and to user testing. Also, just want to address a number of the typefaces that have been dedicated or particularly designed for people with disability. So this slide shows three common ones, so dyslexia, open dyslexia, and Atkinson hyperlegible, designed by the Braille Institute. So we often get asked about these typefaces and if they are more accessible and what makes them more accessible. And I guess I just want to call out that whilst they are designed specifically for people with disability, they're not a catch-all. There is some research to show that some of these fonts like Open Dyslexic actually impede legibility for some people with dyslexia. So what does make all three of these specially designed fonts more accessible is simply some of the characteristics that we've already talked about, like larger character spaces and open apertures. So yeah, just wanted to acknowledge that and call out that they're not a catch-all and should be tested and validated with users. So to summarize, when choosing a font, we want to consider our tone and audience and context, generally opt for sans serifs in a digital context, but serif typefaces can also be really accessible. We want to avoid other decorative fonts, and typefaces designed for people with disability aren't a catch-all. Okay, so we've looked at some key features that make a typeface accessible and how we might go about choosing a typeface. And now we'll look at accessibility considerations for styling and laying out our text. So there's two key things to consider when it comes to this, and it's typeface weights and typeface sizes. So when we say typeface weights, we're talking about the different varieties of a typeface. And so this slide shows a particular typeface with varieties from light through to bold and extra bold, also with italic options. So the importance of using different font weights is to help create visual hierarchy and structure on the page, which we'll talk about a bit more. They can improve legibility and readability as well. So we generally recommend avoiding light and thin fonts because they can be really difficult to read, as you can see on this slide here. And we also recommend avoiding italics as they can impede legibility. The other important thing to consider is font sizes. So there is no specific recommendation in guidelines, and you'll hear lots of slightly different recommendations and different units of measurements used around recommended font sizes. We generally talk about pixels in a digital context as it's an absolute measurement related to the size of the text as it's seen on the screen. And 16 pixels is our recommended minimum text size for on-screen body text. This is based on other research out there and what we see in user research findings. And this is also about 12 point if you're working in something like Word or PowerPoint. But it can vary because some typefaces tend to run smaller or larger in terms of point size. And when choosing your font size, again, it's not an absolute because you need to consider other factors like the contrast with the background and the text weight, which might mean you need to bump up your font size. But generally 16 pixels as a minimum is what we refer to. Okay, so let's talk about creating visual hierarchy. So using variations in fonts, typeface sizes and weights is one of the key ways we can look at creating visual hierarchy. And what we mean by visual hierarchy is providing a clear logical order in which the user or the reader's eye should move around the page to consume content. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen where there's no styling or formatting of text, the eye kind of just swims aimlessly and you're probably not going to get through reading that whole paragraph. But on the right, hopefully you'll read the main heading first, and then we have a subheading or a heading level 2, and then you'll likely glance at the body text and jump down to the bold word and the link. So creating this kind of visual hierarchy with the use of good heading structure and styling is especially important for people with low vision, to give an impression of structure on the page and can help them know when to zoom in, know where to zoom in on different areas of content. So let's just take a bit of a closer look at the formatting that we saw on the right-hand side of the previous slide. So again, we have our body text, our body copy as a 16 pixel, and its font weight, is regular. And again, we do need to consider this in context, because I'm not sure how it looks on your screen, but this is quite small for something like a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so now we can see that our heading level 1 is styled as black, and it's the largest text on the page. And we have the heading level 2 styled as bold, and it's the second largest text on the page. It is difficult to recommend specific sizes for headings, as it's dependent on the number of heading levels you have, things like what typeface you're using and the weight, etc. But it is important for web designers to size headings relative to body text. So usually using a measurement like percent, as opposed to setting specific pixels sizes. So I've seen at least 20% larger for the smallest heading recommended in some studies. And relative sizing is important for responsive web design. So that's that text is resized proportionately to the screen people are viewing the content on, like when people are moving from a desktop to a phone, for example. And a recent example we saw in user testing for a government website was screen magnifier users actually having to zoom in and out a lot when they were viewing text content on their phone, as the headings remained huge as they were in the desktop version. So they weren't proportionate to the size of the screen, which actually really impeded legibility, readability, and the user experience in that instance. So here's just a little visual to illustrate what I'm talking about when it comes to responsive text. So you can see on the screen, the image is a heading and a body paragraph of placeholder text on a desktop, and then superimposed on that is the image of a phone, and the heading size has come down much smaller relative to the screen size, and so has the paragraph width to avoid horizontal scrolling. Okay, another thing to consider when styling is using bold text to emphasize keywords. That can be a really useful way to help users gain key information when they're scanning a page. And it's important to highlight, generally don't use italics for that kind of emphasis, as they can impede legibility. We recommend bolding and underline links and using consistent styling throughout your website or document for links, so people will know that they are interactive. Okay, and let's make sure in our font, our styling and layout, that we're also considering screen reader users. So we don't want to be styling just from a visual perspective. So things like making sure our headings are coded and marked up correctly for web content, or using things like the built-in heading styles in Word or PowerPoint will mean that they're actually read out as headings for screen reader users, which is often how people navigate through content. Other screen reader considerations are things like using the strong tag instead of the B tag for bold text. So the bold isn't just a visual indicator of this is a keyword, but screen reader users can also hear the emphasis as well. Okay, another thing to touch on is the spacing between lines of text. So often if text is spaced too close together, we have an example of this on the left-hand side of the screen. It can be difficult for people to follow from line to line. You can lose your place in the text, and similarly with text that is spaced too widely, the white space can create patterns within the text. Whereas ideally we recommend 1.5 times the text size between lines of text and about 2 times the text size between paragraphs, but this can vary based on whatever typeface you're using and the context. And paragraph widths are another super important one to consider from a low vision perspective, and particularly people using dedicated screen magnification assistive technology. So we recommend a maximum of 80 characters for a paragraph width. And this means that ideally people using a screen magnifier will be able to avoid or really limit horizontal scrolling across paragraphs, which can be really arduous when reading long sections of text. And finally, I'd like to talk about paragraph alignment. So generally, we recommend making sure that you left align your paragraph so you have a clear, consistent line down the left-hand side of the page. Again, this is for English as a language, and so it's a place for the eye to return back to when reading. And you might think that both left align and justified do offer this to the reader, but the reason we recommend avoiding justified text from an accessibility perspective is that there is a lot of white spaces that are formed between the words, which create what we call rivers, and they can be really distracting for people reading the passage. Okay, so to quickly recap on typographic layout and styling, we recommend using text weight and size to create visual hierarchy. 16 pixels or about 12 points is our minimum recommendation for body text size. Headings should be sized relative to body text. Make sure we're considering screen reader users. Keep paragraphs widths narrow and left align our paragraphs. And I appreciate that that was an absolute whirlwind of information today, but what I really want to finish on is the importance of designing with people with disabilities. So considering the design holistically and recognizing that typography is an important part, but it's just one aspect. So we always recommend testing with users and particularly people with disability early and often, and make sure you're including diverse demographics, test across platforms like desktop and mobile, and consider the whole experience, so not just the one interaction that people might be having with your organisation or the service that you're providing. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I believe we have hopefully left some time for a few questions, so I will pass over to Ben and see if any have come through.
Thanks, Jacinta. That was probably one of the most detailed explanations of typography and inclusive design that I personally have seen in my 20 years. So I think that was wonderful. We do have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. We're not going to be able to cover all of them. I think hopefully you appreciate that Jacinta went into quite a lot of detail today. But we will collate them and answer them in an email. So at least we can see if we can get to some of them. I think there's, first of all, Chris, you had a question around using page assist, so reading assistance plugins for web pages. I think that's, if it's basically up to the user. I don't think we would say we would have any particular judgment call apart from it can be super useful for people using those extra assistive technology. That's enabling people to do font sizes, change typefaces, etc. But I just don't think they're used that much. Is there a standard way to determine tracking, Jacinta?
Not that I'm aware of that, or that I could find in other research, and certainly not that we've come across from our user research. Again, I think it does depend on the font, and different fonts will have different tracking already kind of built in. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give a specific number on that. I can do some more research and follow up in the blog following this if there's anything further to say about that one, but great question.
And I think we had Stephanie had a similar, you were talking about a similar thing, and you mentioned kerning as well.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's another great question. So kerning is actually the space of letters, the space between two individual letters, rather than between all of the letters within the word. So it's often if you have a capital letter at the start of a word and then the next lowercase letter, sometimes you might need to boost up or reduce down that kerning if they're touching each other, for example, which may impede legibility. And that's usually something that a graphic designer would do in a print or digital context in tools like Illustrator or InDesign. Sorry.
And then there's a few questions about using selected typefaces for brand. I think Vernon, you asked that as well as a few other people. So I think I can cover that in terms of like, if you want to use particular decorative font sizes or cursive typefaces, I think it comes back to test them with users. I think what Jacinta's gone through is basically, here's some guidelines to assess the fonts that you are most likely to be accessible and inclusive, but follow those guidelines. And then same as any other part of human-centered design, your ultimate question is answered by talking to humans. We had a few questions around the apostrophe after the FAQ, but I think you covered that, Jacinta. Danny asked around using the fancy fonts, so that's pretty much the same answer. Test it. Then we covered dyslexic fonts. We had a question which I'm actually, not being a graphic designer, I'm not sure if I could answer, but in Katie, you asked about using optical or metrics for kerning.
That's a great question, and honestly one that I will need to do a bit more research on and get back to you. It's been a little while since I've touched the tools of the trade, like InDesign being more on the research side, but I can certainly follow up on that, Katie. Or if anyone else, any designers on the call know, perhaps you could help Katie out in the chat as well.
Vernon, you asked around heading levels 5 and 6 ever being smaller than the body copy. I would say probably not. They might be the same size, but they might have a different weight, just because the purpose of the heading is to enable visual structure, to that visual hierarchy, and also to be semantically correct for screen readers. So I probably wouldn't recommend making them smaller than body copy.
No, and I know in Microsoft Word, sometimes that might be the case, particularly if you're opting for a 12-point font, and a lot of the built-in styles use things like italics, but you can go in and edit the built-in heading styles to apply throughout your document as well.
And Birdie, you asked about links that are bolded. In our research, we found that underline and bold really help people identify and scan the page for links. So our recommendation is to do both. So I don't know where the previous recommendation comes from, but certainly that's what we would suggest. I had a question about Comic Sans font.
Yeah, great question. I think that was Diana that sent that through. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about covering this in the presentation, but just couldn't squeeze everything in there. But when it comes to Comic Sans font, I know there's some research out there around it actually being more accessible for some people with dyslexia, for example. But anecdotally, we've also found that it can really impede legibility for some people with dyslexia or other disabilities. So again, it does come back to testing in context to sound like a broken record. And it's also a very specific kind of tone and feel that gives. So it depends whether that's most applicable to your context.
Yes, I am dyslexic myself, and personally, as a opinion of one, I don't actually find Comic Sans easier to read, but that's a personal opinion more than anything else. So color contrast, I think the WCAG guidelines does specify the difference between large and small fonts, which is, Alana, you posted that, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I should know this backwards. But yeah, I would refer back to the WCAG guidelines when you're talking about color contrast and font sizes. Using of italics, I think you touched on that as well, from Katie. So italics means that you're squishing the vertical lines, and therefore it's probably less legible. Again, test it. In some situations it might be fine.
Yeah, and I think Katie's question specifically asked about things like referencing that does call for use of italics. There's other aspects that we looked at in the 8 accessible typeface tips that you might be able to adjust, or like choosing one with a more open counter space or a wider tracking might help an italics font to be more accessible.
Yes. So, I mean, we've run to hour, which is the end of today's session, but we will collate all the questions and everything else that's come up in the chat, and I'll answer them in a little bit more detail, and then send it out to the participants the attendees today. Participants, I'm not doing research, and hopefully that will give you a few more detailed answers to what we covered today. So again, thank you so much for attending. I hope you found that as enjoyable as I did. It's certainly super detailed, and I think it covers so much in terms of what you need to think about when choosing typography with an inclusive lens.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone for your amazing questions.